The question lingers like a whisper carried through the ruins of a dead city, a question no imperial citizen would ever dare speak aloud. Everyone knows the legends, the noble Imperial Knights, towering war engines piloted by ancient bloodlines sworn to defend mankind. Stories depict them as heroic saviors, striding across battlefields to crush Xeno's horrors and heretical threats beneath adamantium feet. But legends, like light seen through stained glass, hide more than they reveal. And beneath the polished myth lies a truth far more complex, far more terrifying, than the imperial propaganda your ancestors memorized in school. This is the truth the administratum will never print, the ecclesiarchy will never preach, and the noble houses will never allow to be spoken. It is the truth civilians whisper only in their homes, voices trembling, hoping the walls don't have ears. How do Imperial Knights really treat the people they claim to protect? To understand this truth, you must first understand fear, not the frantic, gasping terror of battle, but a quiet, suffocating fear, the kind that lives in the soul of any human who has ever stood in the shadow of a knight. Civilians describe the feeling the same way. A crushing sense of smallness, a realization that their lives mean almost nothing to the towering god machine stalking the horizon. For a knight is not just a soldier. It is a walking mountain of ceramite, plasma coils, and centuries-old arrogance. To its pilot, trained from birth to view themselves as the chosen guardians of humanity, the average civilian is barely a note in a song, easy to ignore, easier to silence. And in a galaxy where survival is bought only through obedience, the line between protector and oppressor thins until it becomes indistinguishable. Our story begins on the fractured agri-world of Helion Prime, a place where farmers once tended endless fields under a warm, golden sun. Now the sky is choked with smoke, and the air tastes of metal and ash. Most of the population huddles in makeshift shelters built from the skeletons of burned-out vehicles, praying every night that tomorrow will bring fewer horrors than the day before. The Imperium calls Helion Prime a stabilized war zone, a clinical phrase that hides the chaos beneath it. But the people know better. They are trapped between invading heretics on one side, and the iron tread of their supposed protectors on the other. And in the middle of this fractured world stands a single house, House Caradriel, its banners flying proudly even as everything around them burns. For generations, House Caradriel has claimed to be the shield of Helion Prime. Their pilots speak of duty, honor, tradition, yet their boots never touch the ground ordinary citizens walk upon. They rule from the heights of their citadel, far above the smoke and confusion, emerging only when war calls for their colossal intervention. Civilians see them not as noble guardians, but as judgment made manifest. And when their knights approach, every man, woman, and child knows to fall to their knees, heads bowed, eyes downcast. Not out of reverence, out of instinct, out of terror, because everyone has heard the stories of what happens when a knight feels disrespected, or simply inconvenienced. In the heart of Helion Prime's broken capital, a young archivist named Lisa Kellen records what the administratum demands: numbers, losses, and damage reports. But she also records what they forbid: the testimonies of civilians who have experienced the crushing presence of the knights firsthand. These accounts aren't heroic. They aren't glorious. They are filled with shaking voices and memories too painful to speak aloud except in the quietest hours of the night. And as you listen to Lisa's words, her careful documentation of everything the Imperium wants forgotten, you begin to see the truth not through propaganda, but through the frightened eyes of those who live beneath the night's massive shadows. For every tale of noble sacrifice, there is another whispered in fear, stories of entire settlements displaced because a knight needed a clear line of fire, families crushed when a pilot misjudged a step but refused to acknowledge fault, children terrified not of Xenos but of the thunderous footsteps of the war machines supposedly sent to defend them. The Imperium has a phrase for these casualties: acceptable collateral. But to the people who live through them, they are not numbers. They are scars, scars carved into land, memory, and bone. And so, our descent into this forbidden truth begins. Not with a battle, not with a knight's glorious charge, but with a question few dare to ask. What does it truly mean to be protected by an Imperial Knight? And what happens when the protector does not see you as a person at all? That was the question pulsing in every heart on Helion Prime the day the ground began to shake, long before anyone even saw the approaching night. You can hear stories about these machines your entire life, read about them in sanctioned histories, hear priests speak of their noble purpose, but nothing prepares you for the sensation of the world itself reacting to their presence. Buildings tremble, nerves snap tight, silence spreads like a sickness across the streets. Even people who have never seen a knight instinctively know that something overwhelmingly powerful is drawing near. Instinct, after all, is older than civilization, and it understands fear far better than law or faith ever could. Lisa Kellen, still sorting through forbidden testimonies in the dimly lit archives, felt the vibration first, soft, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat echoing through stone. But it wasn't her heart that pounded. It was something vast, something heavy, something that made dust shake loose from the ceiling as if the entire building exhaled in dread. She stood perfectly still, listening to the slow, deliberate cadence of footsteps that grew heavier with every passing second. Her breath caught in her throat, not because she feared the night itself, but because she feared what always followed its arrival: disruption, displacement, or destruction. The truth she had been recording for months was about to step into her life directly, whether she wanted it or not. For civilians in the lower districts, the question wasn't, who is coming? It was, what will they take this time? Because knights rarely arrived without a purpose. They came to assert order, demand tribute, claim resources, or carve a path through crowded streets simply because it was the most efficient route to the warfront. To the noble house, these were strategic necessities. To the people beneath their feet, they were unchallengeable decrees. No negotiation, no appeal, just the crushing inevitability of metal and tradition. Outside the archives, thousands of citizens spilled out from their shelters and ramshackle homes, not out of curiosity, but out of conditioned obedience. Kneeling was safer than standing. Silence was safer than questions. Every adult understood this. Every child learned it early. And every elder remembered the times someone had dared to ignore these unwritten rules, and paid dearly for it. As the towering silhouette finally emerged through the smoke, people saw the crest of House Caradriel blazing upon its armor, an emblem that was supposed to inspire hope. Instead, it inspired a desperate, resigned stillness. The night did not slow as it approached the crowded district. It did not hesitate. It did not acknowledge the sea of bowed heads. It simply strode forward, its massive footfalls cracking stone, crushing abandoned carts, and shaking walls already weak from war and famine. To a knight, the people were obstacles. To the people, the night was law. But something was different this time. The air felt heavier. The machine's movements lacked the predictable rhythm citizens had grown used to. And Lisa, watching from the darkened doorway of the archives, sensed a shift in the atmosphere, not around the night, but within the crowd itself. For the first time in generations, she saw not just fear, but resentment. Eyes lifted, not in defiance, but in a quiet, wounded fury. People no longer whispered about what knights might do to them. They whispered about what they were willing to endure, and what they were no longer willing to accept. In that moment, a question hung over the capital like a storm waiting to break. How long can a protector treat its people like dust beneath its feet before those people decide they have nothing left to lose? The tremor of the knight's final footsteps faded, leaving behind an eerie silence, one that felt less like submission and more like the stillness just before something finally snaps. That question simmered through the streets of Helion Prime long after the knight's footsteps faded into the distance. Fear had always existed here, fear of war, fear of hunger, fear of the unknown, but this was different. This fear had a shape, a crest, a towering form of metal and arrogance that walked through their lives without ever noticing the terror it left behind. And in the cracks between those unspoken truths, something new began to take root. Not rebellion, not resistance, something quieter, but far more dangerous. Awareness. Lisa Kellen felt it first. She walked through the dust-choked corridors of the archives, replaying the events of the day. The Knights' arrival had been routine, but the reaction of the people was not. She had seen mothers clutch their children a little too tightly, workers pause a little too long before kneeling, elders raising their eyes just enough to glimpse the machine towering above them. These were small things, tiny fractures in the wall of obedience, but fractures spread. And once they do, the entire structure becomes unstable. Inside the archives, Lisa returned to her hidden recordings. Her pulse quickened as she listened to the trembling voices she had collected in secret. Civilians who spoke of loved ones lost not to heretics or Xenos, but to their own supposed defenders. Farmers whose fields were trampled because a knight required a direct route. Merchants whose livelihoods were destroyed when a noble pilot declared their district obstructive. And none of them had received compensation. None had received acknowledgement. Their pain existed only in whispers and forbidden documents. Helion Prime was a world with two realities. The one written in official reports, and the one lived by its people. The distance between them grew wider every day. In the lower district, those whispers grew bolder. Groups gathered in the shadows of ruined buildings, speaking in hushed tones, never shouting, never rallying, just sharing stories. Each story was like a spark falling into a dry field. One spark alone is harmless. But 1,000, a single breeze could turn them into a wildfire. And the Knights, in their towering arrogance, had not noticed the wind shifting. Among the civilians was a man named Torin Vale, a former engineer whose workshop had been crushed beneath a knight's stride. He had lost everything, his tools, his livelihood, and the tiny community that once depended on him for repairs. To the noble house, it had been an unfortunate but necessary consequence of war. To Torin, it was a line that should never have been crossed. And unlike others, he wasn't afraid to say it aloud. Torin's voice carried weight not because he was loud, but because he spoke calmly, logically, with a tone that suggested he was done being afraid. People gathered around him not out of defiance but out of desperation. They needed someone to say what they had all been thinking. That protection without accountability is nothing more than domination dressed in polished armor. Lisa listened to these whispers spreading like roots beneath the soil of the city. She knew that if House Caradriel discovered them, the punishment would be swift and merciless. But she also knew something had changed in the air. The people were no longer content to live in fear. They wanted answers. And answers are dangerous in a society that survives on obedience. But on Helion Prime, danger was becoming normal. Fear was becoming background noise. And silence was starting to feel like a wound that could no longer be ignored. The Knights believed they ruled through honor. But the people were beginning to learn that honor means nothing if it crushes those beneath it. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the smoke-choked sky, another tremor echoed, faint, but unmistakable. Another night was approaching, and this one was not coming to patrol. It was coming to judge. That was the question that tightened every breath in Helion Prime as the second night approached, its footsteps heavier, slower, and far more deliberate than the last. This was not a routine patrol. This was not a show of presence. This was a message. The civilians didn't know what offense had been committed, what rule had been broken, or what slight had triggered the house's interest. They only knew one thing: Knights did not come twice in one day unless something had stirred their attention. Lisa Kellen sensed it immediately. The vibrations were deeper, resonant enough that the shelves around her rattled with each approaching step. She pressed her palm against a stack of forbidden testimonies, instinctively shielding them, as if the papers themselves could drop punishment upon her. But the night wasn't here for her. At least, not yet. Its path cut straight toward the lower district, toward the very streets where whispers had finally begun to find their shape. Torrin Vale stood in the center of those streets, not defiantly, but unmoving. His expression held no courage, only exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man who had nothing left to lose. Around him, the crowd formed in a tight, nervous cluster. They kneeled automatically, though their breaths trembled and their eyes darted toward the enormous silhouette emerging through the smoke. But Torrin did not kneel. Not out of rebellion, out of a simple refusal to abase himself before the machine that had stolen everything from him. The knight loomed above them, a titan of polished metal and ancestral pride, every inch of it crafted to inspire subservience. Its crest glowed faintly, the symbol of House Caradriel reflecting the fires burning across the district. The pilot inside, hidden behind layers of armor and ritual, saw the world differently than the people below. To them, civilians were variables in a battlefield equation. To them, a single life meant little compared to the legacy of their lineage. And to them, a man refusing to kneel was not a tragedy. It was an insult. Lisa watched from a distance, her heart pounding not from proximity, but from dread. She saw the knight angle its massive form toward Torrin, scanning him the way one might examine a stray animal on the edge of a road. And in that moment, she understood something terrible. Knights did not simply enforce order. They enforced hierarchy. And hierarchy did not tolerate those who rose above their assigned place. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the sound, the roar of a weapon charging, the thunder of a step meant to crush, the hiss of a warning broadcast. But none came. Instead, the knight did something far worse. It simply stood there, towering and silent, letting its presence do the work. No threats, no commands, only an oppressive, suffocating stillness. And that silence said more than any weapon ever could: obey, or be erased. Torrin finally raised his head, meeting the faceless gaze of the Titan. Not with anger, not with bravery, with a simple, painful question that carried through the dust-choked air. Do you even see us? For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Even the wind held still, as if waiting for an answer. But knights were not built to see. They were built to act, to serve, to destroy, and to uphold a tradition older than the broken city surrounding them. The Titan shifted its stance, metal joints groaning like an ancient beast awakening, and leaned forward just enough to make the message unmistakable. It saw him, but it did not care. Fear rippled through the crowd, not from the knight's power, but from the realization that they had never mattered in the first place. And as Torrin stood frozen in that oppressive shadow, Lisa felt something inside her tighten, a mix of sorrow, fury, and a dawning understanding that the truth she was collecting was not just dangerous. It was essential, because if the people of Helion Prime were ever to reclaim their dignity, they first needed to understand why it had been taken from them. This encounter was not the end. It was the beginning of a fracture, small, quiet, but undeniable. A fracture in the trust that had kept the people obedient for generations. And fractures have a way of spreading, even in the shadow of giants. That question slithered into the minds of Helion Prime's civilians after the confrontation between Torrin Vale and the Knight. It didn't erupt loudly. It didn't spark rebellion overnight. Instead, it settled like dust, quiet, patient, impossible to sweep away. Something had changed in the air. Not defiance, not hope, awareness. And awareness is the first crack in any system built on fear. The Knight eventually turned away from Torrin, its titanic frame retreating back toward the upper district with the same cold detachment it had arrived with. But the silence it left behind was louder than its footsteps. The people stared at the space where it had stood, as if expecting the ground itself to reveal answers. Torrin remained motionless, the echo of its shadow still clinging to him. He hadn't been crushed. He hadn't been punished. He had simply been dismissed. And oddly, that was what frightened the people most. Because dismissal meant insignificance. It meant they were so beneath consideration that even punishment was unnecessary. And in a galaxy where human life was already a fragile currency, that realization cut deeper than any blade. Lisa Kellen retreated into the archives, hands trembling, heart racing with a mixture of fear and clarity. She listened again to Torin's question, "Do you even see us?" replaying it in her mind like a mantra. No one had ever confronted a knight like that. No one had dared to break the silent choreography of submission. And while the knight had not retaliated, its indifference had given Lisa something far more dangerous than terror: confirmation. The knights didn't see the people. They saw terrain. Lisa sank into her chair, staring at her hidden cache of testimonies. Hundreds of them. Stories of loss, suffering, displacement, and quiet endurance. But none had been as simple, or as devastating, as Torin's single question. She realized then that she was no longer just collecting accounts of oppression. She was documenting the unraveling of something sacred, the myth of knightly nobility. Meanwhile, in the lower districts, the whispers deepened. People gathered not in defiant groups, but in cautious clusters, families speaking in their kitchens, neighbors leaning close at communal fires, workers whispering between shifts. They weren't discussing rebellion. They weren't plotting upheaval. They were sharing observations, piecing together a truth long buried under tradition. For the first time, they were asking questions like, why did they never speak to us? Why did they never dismount? Why did they act as if we are obstacles instead of citizens? These were not revolutionary thoughts. They were human ones, and that made them dangerous. The noble house, perched atop its ivory citadel, had no idea this subtle shift was happening. Why would they? Their world was built so far above the streets that they never smelled the smoke or heard the cries. Their eyes saw only battlefields, never the people who tilled the soil beneath them. But the knights were not blind to everything. Pilots began noticing irregularities, crowds that hesitated before kneeling, citizens who lifted their eyes for a fraction of a second too long, a new tension coiled beneath the surface. They treated it as unease caused by war, nothing more. They could not imagine that peasants, mere civilians, were capable of thought-outside obedience. But something else was happening too. For the first time in decades, a knight lingered longer than required. Not out of suspicion, but curiosity. A subtle, unsettling curiosity. The pilots were trained to suppress emotion, but they were still human. And humans, when faced with change they do not understand, begin to search for causes. House Caradriel did not yet realize that their world, rooted in honor, hierarchy, and unquestioned dominion, was beginning to shift beneath their feet. But the people felt it. The city felt it. Even the air seemed to vibrate differently, as if the planet itself sensed that something old was fraying. Obedience had been an unbroken ritual for generations. But rituals only survive so long as everyone believes in them. And belief was dying. That was the question rippling through Helion Prime as the days passed after Torin's quiet act of defiance. Nothing explosive had occurred. No riots. No open confrontations. No rallying cries. Just silence. A different kind of silence. A silence that felt heavier, more deliberate, more aware. And that kind of silence is far more dangerous to an oppressive system than any shouted rebellion. The lower districts sensed it first. Routine movements began to shift. People walked differently, more upright, even if cautiously so. Conversations lingered a bit longer in alleyways. The act of kneeling became slower, less instinctive. Children, who had always imitated the fearful behavior of adults, began asking questions their parents were unprepared to answer. Questions like, why did they never talk to us? Why don't they protect us like the stories say? Why did Torin not kneel, and nothing happened? Parents hushed them quickly, of course. But the damage was done. Once a question forms in a child's mind, it spreads like cracks through glass, fast, unstoppable, and revealing the fragility beneath the surface. Lisa Kellen felt the shift too. Her archive chamber, once a place of dread and secrecy, now felt like a sanctuary of truth. She spent hours listening to old testimonies, not because she needed more evidence, but because she needed to understand the pattern forming around her. It became clear that the Knight's treatment of civilians was not a series of isolated incidents. It was a culture, an ingrained, generational detachment rooted in ritual, pride, and the belief that their nobility placed them above the common human struggle. But something else lurked beneath Lisa's observations, something she had been trying to ignore: fear for Torin. The man had unknowingly become a symbol, a quiet one, yes, but a symbol nonetheless. And symbols are dangerous, especially in a society where authority must remain unquestioned. If House Caradriel realized how his simple refusal to kneel had affected the populace, they would not tolerate his continued existence. Meanwhile, the Knight pilots began to take notice. Not through grand revelations, but through small, unsettling anomalies. Citizens who hesitated before obeying commands. Workers who did not scramble out of the path fast enough. Entire streets where people moved with a strange, wary cohesion, as though they were all thinking the same thoughts. None of it was overt, but Knights were trained to read terrain, and the civilians, once scattered like loose sand, were beginning to pack together like hardened soil. And then something peculiar happened. During a routine inspection pass, a Knight came upon a cluster of civilians who did not immediately kneel. They weren't defiant, they weren't hostile, they simply stood there, frozen between fear and confusion, unsure whether the ancient ritual still held meaning. The pilot, confused, issued no command. The Knight did not roar or threaten. It simply stared, and for a long, suffocating moment, the people stared back. They were the first civilians in decades to meet a Knight's gaze without being forced into the dirt. It lasted barely a breath. But it was enough. Afterward, the district buzzed, not with rebellion, but with quiet astonishment. Stories spread faster than the house realized. They traveled through markets, water stations, ruined courtyards, and cramped living quarters. And each retelling chipped away at the myth of absolute obedience. The noble house remained oblivious, cocooned in their rituals and grand strategies. They believed civilians were too beaten down to ever question them, too fragmented to ever unify, too scared to ever resist. And in many ways, they were right. But they had overlooked one fundamental truth of human nature. Fear can keep people silent, but shared fear can bring people together. And once people come together, even the steps of a giant begin to lose their power. As the Grey Knight steps deeper into the vault, the air grows impossibly dense, as if each breath demands a sacrifice. The walls tremble with whispers, ancient and venomous, speaking in 1,000 dead languages. These are not voices meant for mortal minds, yet he pushes on. Ahead, a monolithic slab of obsidian rises from the floor, etched with runes that twist like living serpents. This is the archive of forbidden echoes, a record of every demon ever banished, every ritual ever broken, every lie chaos has whispered since the dawn of time. But such knowledge always comes with a cost. A spectral figure materializes, translucent armor, hollow eyes, a Grey Knight long dead. His voice is a cold warning. Knowledge is a blade. Wield it carefully, or it will carve away your soul. The Knight hesitates. He knows what must be done. To stop the rising chaos incursion, he must read the archive, absorb truths that even the Inquisition hides. He places a gauntleted hand on the monolith. A surge of agony erupts through his skull. Visions explode. Planets consumed by demonic fire. Astartes falling to madness in seconds. An unending shadow spreading beneath the Imperium. A name whispered by every demon in perfect unison. The Knight collapses, blood dripping from his nose, but he clings to consciousness. Because within the horror, he sees a pattern. A plan, a truth, and a coming nightmare far greater than anything the Imperium imagines. He rises, trembling but unbroken. For this knowledge, this cursed, unbearable knowledge, may be the only key to stopping what comes next. In the wake of the Grey Knight's communion with the Forbidden Archive, the world of Helion Prime shifted subtly, imperceptibly to most, but not to those who had been paying attention. The Knight returned from the archive not just with knowledge, but with a weight that seemed to darken the air around him. Every step he took carried more than armor. It carried the burden of truths too dangerous for mortal ears, the kind that twist loyalty into fear, obedience into uncertainty. Torren Vale, still trying to reconcile his survival with the shadow of the towering knight, noticed the change immediately. The once distant machine now exuded a silent menace that no words could capture. It moved through the streets not with the arrogance of tradition, but with the weight of intent, as if every citizen it passed was a question to be answered, one way or another. The people felt it too. Nervous glances began to follow the knight's every motion. Conversations slowed. Children clung tighter to their parents. And Lisa, ever watchful, documented it all with a sense of foreboding she could not name. The difference was subtle, yet horrifying. The knight no longer merely existed among the civilians, it had begun to judge. Every hesitation, every question, every spark of curiosity became a mark in its inscrutable ledger. Torren's defiance had not gone unnoticed. The ripple of silent resistance had reached the ears, or rather, the censors, of the house. And for the first time, the citizens of Helion Prime felt what it truly meant to exist under the scrutiny of a protector who no longer saw them as insignificant, but as potential liabilities. Rumors spread like wildfire. Quiet but insistent. Whispers about Torren's encounter with the First Knight began to mutate, amplified by fear and awe. It saw him, people said, voice barely above a breath. And it did nothing, yet. The yet lingered longer than any words could, a shadow over the city that grew heavier with every passing day. Every citizen now lived with a question that had been unthinkable only days before. What would the knight do next? Even the pilots of House Caradriel began to feel the stirrings of unease. They had been taught that the people existed only as context, background for grand battles and displays of martial prowess. But the rising tension was undeniable. There were shifts in behavior, minor hesitations that no drill could correct, glances that lingered too long, murmurs that carried just beyond the expected silence. The pilot inside the approaching knight did not understand it yet, but the environment had begun to change around him. And in a galaxy built on control and obedience, change is the most dangerous weapon of all. Lisa watched from her hidden vantage point, heart pounding. Every entry she made in her archives now felt like a double-edged sword. She was chronicling not just the actions of the knights, but the reactions of the people, reactions that hinted at a slow, inevitable unraveling. History, she realized, was not being written in the grand halls of the Citadel. It was being whispered between alleys, in the shadows of ruined streets, and in the quiet defiance of those who refused to bow. And somewhere above it all, the knights marched, unaware that the world they were sworn to protect was quietly learning to see them, not as saviors, but as forces of judgment. Forces that could no longer be ignored. Because in Helion Prime, every shadow had a story, and every story had its cost. The streets of Helion Prime were quiet, but not in the usual way. It wasn't fear that held the city in silence this time. It was tension, the taut, invisible thread of uncertainty stretching across every corner. Civilians moved with precision, not out of obedience, but out of calculation. Every glance was measured, every footstep considered. They were no longer mere subjects to be guided, crushed, or ignored. They were witnesses to the cracks appearing in the armor of their so-called protectors. And as the citizens whispered their observations to each other, one thing became clear: the old rituals were failing. Torren Vale had become more than a man, he had become a symbol, though he never sought the role. His act of simple defiance, the refusal to kneel, had spread through the city like wildfire in dry grass. Each retelling added a shade of courage, a fragment of possibility, a spark of something that had not existed for decades: hope. And hope, even in the smallest form, is a weapon more dangerous than any plasma cannon. The Knights of House Caradriel began to notice these subtle shifts. The tension in the streets, the fleeting eye contact, the hesitation before kneeling, these were anomalies. Anomalies they had never accounted for. They were trained to react to threats that came with weapons, armor, or overt hostility. But fear without submission, defiance without noise, that was unfamiliar territory, something the pilots had been taught to dismiss, yet could not entirely ignore. Lisa Kellen's archives were alive with testimony. People recounted subtle acts of resistance, a merchant keeping his stall open even as a night passed, a mother shielding her child's face from the towering armor, a group of workers moving in synchrony not to obey but to observe. Every account told the same story. Obedience was fraying, and the people were starting to understand that their lives, long treated as collateral, had meaning beyond the whims of those they called protectors. The cracks were small at first, almost invisible. But cracks spread, and Helion Prime, long held in the shadow of towering machines, began to shiver with the awareness that even giants could be questioned. The city, once so meticulously controlled, was no longer predictable. Its people no longer purely reactive. In the citadel above, House Caradriel remained confident in its dominion. They still believed that tradition, fear, and the sheer weight of their power could maintain order. Yet the knight returning from the upper sectors, carrying knowledge of what had begun in the streets, felt a subtle, unfamiliar tension, the realization that the world beneath them might not be as compliant as they assumed. For the first time, the citizens began to see that power does not lie in size, in armor, or in ancestry. It lies in awareness, and awareness can spread faster than fear. The question hung over Helion Prime like a gathering storm. How long can obedience hold when everyone begins to understand that the giants guarding them are not infallible? And somewhere in the distance, the tremor of a knight's approach reminded them that the answer would not come quietly. The final tremor arrived without warning. Not a single knight had yet approached the lower districts with intent to harm, yet the air itself felt heavier, charged with inevitability. Torrin Vale stood at the center of the streets, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the massive silhouette of House Caradriel's most ancient knight appeared. This was the culmination, not just of machines and metal, not just of tradition, not just of whispered rebellion, but of a truth long buried under fear and silence. The people beneath the feet of the mighty were awake. The streets, once empty of courage, now pulsed with quiet determination. Mothers held their children close, not out of fear, but to shield them from the knowledge that they were no longer powerless witnesses. Workers, artisans, and survivors held their positions, each step a measured assertion of their presence. They were the same people who had trembled and obeyed for generations, yet now their awareness had transformed them. They understood that the titans above them could crush stone, but not resolve. They could destroy homes, but not memory. They could impose obedience, but they could not erase recognition. The knight paused at the edge of the district, its massive head turning, scanning the silent, expectant crowd. Its pilot, trained for centuries to interpret obedience as trust, hesitated. Something intangible hovered in the air, an unspoken defiance so subtle that it could have been mistaken for coincidence, if not for the ripple of change that had taken hold over the entire district. And then, as the sun struck the metal armor just so, a realization dawned in both pilot and people alike. This world was no longer merely terrain. It was alive, observant, unwilling to kneel in the shadow of fear alone. Torrin stepped forward, not boldly, not arrogantly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has seen injustice and chosen to witness it fully. "Do you see us?" he asked again, this time not to the faceless machine, but to the very system it represented. His words carried further than the metal armor could hear. They echoed in the minds of every civilian, every voice that had been silenced too long. And somewhere within the cold logic of House Caradriel's night, a fracture began to form. Not of armor, not of metal, but of certainty. For the first time, the people realized, they had been seen all along, not in the eyes of a giant, but in their own courage, in the whispered solidarity that had spread like wildfire, in the collective awakening that no machine, no tradition, no titan could extinguish. The knight turned, slowly, deliberately, and walked away. Not in defeat, not in mercy, but in acknowledgement, an acknowledgement that the world beneath its feet had changed. The ground that once trembled with fear now trembled with possibility. And though the legacy of House Caradriel would continue, it would never again walk unchallenged, never again assume that obedience was eternal, and never again mistake fear for respect. Helion Prime would endure, its people would survive, and the stories of that day, whispered and chronicled, would ripple across time like echoes of thunder, that even beneath the shadow of gods in armor, humanity can endure. Because power may crush the body, but it can never crush the will. And in the silence that followed, one truth remained: the giants may walk, but the people had risen.